Okay, so hi and thank you. I am so honored to be here with you today. As you know, my name is Amaya. Please call me Amaya. I'm a critical global health scholar and have been trained in both public health and sociology. And thank you for the introduction now at U of T. Today, I will be asking you to join me in thinking through who benefits from global HIV prevention science. And in doing so, the larger question that I'm asking you to think through with me is, does global health make health, or does global health make data? So this talk, I'm currently located in Toronto, a Haudenosaunee word known in English as Toronto. Toronto consists of ceded land covered under Treaty 13, as well as unceded land that continues to be contested. I would like to acknowledge the traditional territories of the Mississauga of the New Credit First Nation, the Anishinaabe, Wendat, Huron, and the Haudenosaunee Indigenous people, on which the University of Toronto now stands. I also recognize that as a settler living on stolen land, I benefit daily from the ongoing violences and legacies of colonialism. I have an ongoing responsibility to learn about the land I am living on, to cede power to Indigenous people, and to amplify ongoing projects of Indigenous resurgency and sovereignty. And so with that, I would like to ask all of you and all of us to pay keen attention to what's going on in Winnipeg. It's an atrocity, and it's something that needs to be on the forefront of all of our minds. So before we begin, I just want to do a bit of locating. So I am Venezuelan American, and now after 5 years in Toronto, a Canadian permanent resident. Spanish is my first language, and I identify as Latina. Sorry, I'm having a bit of tech issues. Okay. So, and I identify as Latina. It is telling that I'm afforded the honor to be here with you today. I'm a cisgender woman, and I do not take lightly the privilege of being here, and must underscore that the talk today and my scholarship broadly, and all of it, is indebted to my Peruvian teachers who push me daily to recognize and grapple with the extreme privilege and power at the center of who gets to do global health research. So as an HIV prevention researcher, my work centers on the making and the analyzing of data to improve HIV prevention efforts. And as a social theorist, the analyzing of the making of the data. So who gets to do health research? Who are its beneficiaries? Specifically, I study the ways in which power, sexuality, and gender are entangled with contemporary approaches to HIV science. On this slide, you will see a photo of various members of Feminas, a community-based organization in Lima. The text is small, but underneath the photo it reads, Peruvian transgender women say they want more leadership roles in studies involving them as subjects. I want to be clear that politics and power are central to my talk, and thus I want to draw your attention to the word subject. What might it mean to be a subject of HIV research? How does research act as a form of discipline and/or social control? Learning from trans women in Peru, where I have been conducting research since 2009, this talk is meant to be a provocation. And so I ask you to join me in reflecting on our own social location, our privilege, and most importantly, our responsibility as researchers. There is upheaval in global health. We have activists globally to thank for ongoing demands for change and to reimagine a more just future. Thank you to those who name and evidence the ongoing work that colonialism, white supremacy, capitalism, and violence do to uphold the power and privilege of a few, including myself, who do global health research and earn a living doing so. We as scholars and as practitioners of global health have work to do. There's simply too much at stake. And so this is our call, and the call for the next generation of global health researchers and practitioners. So to imagine and reimagine a more just praxis for HIV research globally, I ask you to join me in sitting with the discomfort of the following questions. Does HIV research make health, or does HIV research make data? How can we ensure that science and knowledge translate into tangible health gains? Let me tell you why I ask these questions and why I believe that these questions get us to the heart of extractive logics in global health. First, we need to consider the big shifts in HIV science that have fostered new data and new approaches to the epidemic. The fourth decade of HIV and AIDS has ushered in a new era of how and what research on the virus is conducted, with an explicit focus on pharmaceutical-based prevention and the new technologies at play. The advent of pre-exposure prophylaxis, or PrEP, is a remarkable innovation to prevent HIV acquisition. Its development has led to a boom in research among populations considered to be most at risk and thus in most in need of PrEP. People classified as men who have sex with men, often referred to as MSM, and especially trans women have become central in this focus. The shift to prevention and emphasis on certain groups necessitates a rethinking of the politics of data extracted from people of diverse genders and sexualities in the pursuit of HIV prevention. For my career, I have and continue to work on HIV prevention for communities at heightened vulnerability to HIV. Peru has been central to the testing of HIV prevention strategies. Take, for example, the fact that Peru contributed more than 50% to the global sample for the watershed IPREX study that sparked significant changes to both global policy and associated scientific actions to support PrEP for HIV prevention. Yet today, more than a decade after IPREX, the evidence continues to reflect a burden of HIV among the very communities that made this science happen, namely gender and sexual minorities. Why? There is a need to examine how HIV biomedical prevention may incorporate contradictory practices that can perpetuate these existing inequalities. So I need to state this another way. When I first started working in Peru, available convenience samples evidence that HIV prevalence among trans communities was around 30%. Last month, our own study with young trans women aged 18 to 24 evidenced that two out of every five women who participated in our study, or 40%, were living with HIV. This is shocking. Since 2009, I've been involved in numerous studies targeting this population with total funding above 5 million USD. So I ask you, what the hell is going on? Obviously, there's a lot going on, and there's a lot to account for. Yes, I've been pushed to think through the limits of this example. These are convenience samples, not the same population. What about COVID-19 effects? But to me, these questions are irrelevant when faced with the dire reality 2 out of every 5 women in our current study are currently living with HIV. To seriously start disrupting how global health operates and understand what needs to be changed, I want to share with you 3 lessons that I have learned from Peruvian trans women. The first lesson, why more research and not more health, underscores the discordance between the increased frequency of PrEP research targeting trans women in Peru and the limited actual improvements in HIV outcomes among trans women. The trans women who shared their experiences participating in HIV prevention research often described the choice to participate in HIV prevention studies as complicated by the limited HIV prevention and care options for trans women within the existing healthcare system. Yet even those who noted the importance of HIV research for access to care were wary of the surge of clinical trials and noted that the health impact for trans women in Lima was limited. Care was often described as ephemeral, and HIV acquisition frequently posited as inevitable. 27-year-old Danica told us, "I participate in studies now so that I can get care, but what happens once I get sick? These studies end." While many participants said they valued the care provided by studies, they questioned the lack of long-term health benefits for trans women. And this was further complicated by wariness of foreign investigators, perceived to be driving the PrEP research agenda. For example, another participant, Maria, told us, "How long have gringos been researching us? Why are we still getting sick? And what will I do if I get HIV?" The second lesson centers on reframing research processes as a research marketplace, underscoring the political economy through which global health data are produced and circulate. For example, while observing observations of an ongoing HIV prevention study, Maite, a peer recruiter and study staff, commented, "Several of the travesti that are coming in don't understand the word transgender and don't identify as transgender. This has become a problem on the surveys since they are leaving this question blank, and Dr. Smith has emailed me twice now about missing data on the surveys." To this, the leader, Yasmin, responded, "Tell them that travesti is the same thing as transgender and that the surveys were written by gringos. Plus, if she wants to continue in the study, continue getting PrEP, and continue getting money, she needs to fill out the survey completely." This interaction demonstrates the politics implicated in creating data to meet the needs of this research economy, the active practices of minimizing missing data for quality exportation. This example also highlights the uncomfortable tension within gringo-designed research that lacks contextual relevance. Travesti is a term to describe trans feminine identities that is closely associated with street-based sex work and erotic economies, and often reflects a lower class within Peruvian society and within the Peruvian context. So is travesti really the same thing as transgender? And if not, why say it is? This example leads us to question not only the value of the data collected, but the coercive nature of the process itself. The third lesson highlights the contradiction that PrEP is a key HIV prevention technology that has been tested repeatedly on trans women, but is not readily available to them, furthering the belief that their community is not actually PrEP's intended users. As noted in a formative focus group, one participant told us, "Why are we trans women being used like guinea pigs? Every single one of us." This disjuncture was further amplified by the conflict between the short-term rewards provided by financial incentives and temporary access to new medications against the long-term public health failures, leading to limited access for successful therapies and care. As described by one participant, Angelica, "What can I tell you? Do I have a problem that my community is treated like an experiment? Yes. But we continue to participate and work for these studies because we are seen. We at least get some HIV care. Sometimes we get PrEP, and we even get paid." These brief examples, while alarming independently, must be held together. Jointly, the key tensions reflect extractive logics at the center of global health. As John Crane argues, global health science is the uncomfortable mix of preventable suffering and scientific productivity that paradoxically embodies and even benefits from the very inequalities it aspires to redress. In listening to and learning from trans women, there is wisdom in their research mistrust, in mistrust of a system that privileges and replicates extractive data practices. As such, hesitancy, mistrust, loss to follow-up, poor enrollment cannot be understood as a trait of trans women to be addressed solely through education about the research process, but as a justified response to systemic inequities replicated by and manifested through the extractive logics of research. Their mistrust is a learned community insight that underscores the inequities between communities, researchers, and the research enterprise. Yet, there's another piece that must be underscored to understand the pervasiveness of these paradoxes in global health research in Peru and beyond. This additional piece is the value driving extractive practices. Academic research begets more academic research, producing scientific knowledge as global currency. This is true for scientists and researchers like me who realize that the ability to secure funding and progress through the ranks of academic promotion depends on participating in this research economy. To illustrate what I mean by describing our field of research as an economy, the image on the slide shows the process of data transformation and the value accrued at each stage, from the collection to the entrepreneurial opportunities presented in the collection, management and analyses of the data, to the knowledge dissemination, typically in the form of publications and conference talks that yield scientific capital through acknowledgement and career advancement. Manuscripts operate as the ultimate record keeper of a scholar's scientific reach, and they are essential to demonstrate expertise and acquire grants and serve as revenue generating assets to indicate ownership and expertise. Jointly, these processes, both individually and collectively, foster systems that make and sustain HIV enterprise on a global scale. While this is presented linearly, this is far from true. These processes are messy, they're complicated, and they have differential gains. Here it is helpful to point to the reality that many US scientists, I'm American, I'll remind you of that. So much of my focus is on how US scientists have enhanced their own careers by being trained in Peru, including me. And yet, when speaking to Peruvian researchers about their professional relationships with US investigators, many scoff and refer to international health researchers' imbalance of power. Importantly, this imbalance is systemic. Take, for example, ownership of knowledge dissemination. The path to establishing expertise is understood to primarily apply to investigators from the global north, namely the United States, and only the most senior Peruvian collaborators. For example, Juancito, a Peruvian project coordinator with more than a decade of HIV research experience, a Peruvian medical degree, and a US master's degree in epidemiology described, publications don't really help me keep a job. They would be good, but I will never be a leader of HIV research in Peru. That role is reserved for US investigators. Power imbalances described by Juancito in knowledge dissemination are a symptom of greater systemic fissures. To further disentangle notions of imbalance, it is important to describe how funding is distributed and operates. I'm going to provide two examples, one in the US context and then one in the Canadian context. The US NIH funding awards include direct costs, and these are costs for expenditures budgeted for scientific research and listed in the public domain. These awards also include indirect costs, defined as expenditures related to facilities and administrations, which go directly to an institution. NIH does not determine indirect costs. Rather, each US academic institution establishes their own fee. However, so before I get to this, so let me give you a range of this. Many public universities, so for example, I'm sure someone will correct me for being wrong, but the University of California system is hovering around like 30% to 50% in indirects, versus Harvard and Columbia are well above 80% indirects. However, NIH does limit the number of indirect fees for a foreign institution that they can charge, and this is limited to 8%. So the bad example I gave of ranging between like 35 to 80%, we need to compare that to the 8% that's limited to foreign sites. This simple example illustrates two key points. The first is the systemic imbalance between US and foreign sites with respect to funding allocation. While this relates to indirect, not direct costs, it's important to note that, at least in my case, with Peruvian HIV studies, 8% indirect costs does not cover the expenditures related to facilities and to the administration when the majority of the work takes place internationally. The second point is that the structure of the funding has created a context in which scientific research is an enterprise, not only for researchers, but for academic institutions. Second, while the Canadian Institutes of Health Research does not cap indirect in the same way that the US NIH does, systemically, there are limited pathways to pay and support international PIs and community leaders as central intellectual contributors to ongoing research agendas. Perhaps some of you here today have solutions that you can share with me, because this is my central tension and frustration that I'm trying to work with, is how do I pay Peruvian PIs at both academic institutions and community organizations? I've heard some solutions, such as remove them as PI and then pay, or the loophole of giving institutional letters that attest that international PIs are not being compensated by their employer for time spent on research activities. Yes, these are in part solutions, but these are in part solutions for some PIs working at some international institutions. But for me, the larger take home of this is that the default mechanisms are not set up to support equitable collaborations. Indeed, the system isn't designed to even contemplate anything besides global North power. But wait, wasn't this talk about learning from trans women about the harms of extractive data practices in HIV science? Yes, and these are not lessons that we can learn from without recognizing the larger system at play. To begin to consider actionable improvements to HIV biomedical research, it is critical to draw attention to the multiple forms of power that underlie the politics of HIV science, which impact all involved in this enterprise. The story of extractive data practices traded in a global economy is not unique to the contemporary HIV industry, but rather a key element of research that frequently leverages made vulnerable communities that this research is meant to serve, but leverages them as a living laboratory to further research. The lessons and tensions that I am sharing with you today should not be understood as something that's happening over there in Peru. Rather, my hope is that these three lessons presented today, why more research and not more health, the economies of research, and are we just guinea pigs, will resonate with many of you doing this work day to day who actively seek to ameliorate the pervasive disparities that shape vulnerability to HIV. And yet, when making these arguments, I'm often met with comments from colleagues who push back and advocate for more active allyship, suggesting that a possible way forward is better community relations, more robust community advisory boards, methods and design co-developed with community. To this, my answer is yes, but yes in part. The other part, which must go hand in hand, is a recognition of the greater systemic issues, namely the tenets of capitalism that are inextricably intermeshed with global HIV science and practice, namely the push for more data without the push for more health. While the imbalance of funding and direct-indirect funds is a small piece of this puzzle, it is quite illustrative of the inequities built in and replicated by the system. The call to action is not as simple as let's deal with the indirects in the US or let's figure out appropriate funding mechanisms for international PIs. I wish it were. Rather, our work and responsibility as researchers lies in actively recognizing our role and the part we play in the perpetuation of extractive data and the benefits received. This is the first step to rectify broken trust between community and researchers. And this is the base from which we must start to imagine, build, and sustain a more just HIV science. So in the work to come, we must remember and to remind each other that when we do not name capitalism, colonialism, racism, heteropatriarchy, and other intersecting modes of oppression, the possible harms of research are too easily ignored. Our call for equity and a more just imagining of what HIV science can and should be cannot be divorced from an examination of the role that power and politics play in the perpetuation of extractive data practices. So the two photos presented here highlight the strength, power, and ongoing solidarity enacted by trans and gender non-binary people in Peru. It is my reminder of who I am accountable to. So yes, let's push, let's fight, let's advocate, let's join those brave enough to call for a disruption in HIV science. But in doing so, we need critical reflection, awareness of the role we as researchers play in the system and how the system is broken. It is only then that we can move towards accountability. So, to enact change, we must underscore that HIV science is political. To listen to and learn from made vulnerable communities that we are accountable to, justice and solidarity must drive our praxis. This depends on authentic community relationships and co-learning, and this requires funding, not solely as peer recruiters or in a community advisory board capacity, but real money for and to acknowledge the labor of grassroots organization, the brilliance of community members, and the dedication of global partners to make the research happen. The funding to support health and not data necessitates bearing witness to the violences perpetuated by the system, to disrupt and to invite change. Hope for change is necessary, but in the wisdom of the late Paulo Freire, my hope alone is not enough. Rather, we need critical hope as a collective and iterative praxis. We need to take action by learning about and from the discomforts, the contradictions, and the violences of global HIV science to move towards reimagined possibilities. So, in an aim to stimulate reflection and critical hope, I ask you, why more data and not more health? Who benefits from the data, and who is responsible for addressing the oppressions that yield pervasive and growing health disparities? And so, first and foremost, thank you, and I look forward to continuing to think through these issues together. But again, I want to remind us that this was meant to be a provocation, and this was meant to invite a discussion and a hope that we can all co-learn and engage in a discussion. So with that, again, thank you, and I really do look forward to your questions and comments.
Let me think. So you have spent time doing research and work in South America and in North America. And it strikes me that some of the issues you talk about, like power differentials between researchers and research participants, particularly as they pertain to access to money and health resources, also exist here in Canada, certainly also in the United States, and that there may be on different scales and with some different kind of parameters thrown in, but I think of examples locally of where research participants are put through studies to answer research questions with little return in terms of like what happens at the end in terms of health resources. And even in the example you give of PrEP, I mean, I'm sad, not entirely surprised, but sad to hear that there remain pretty major structural and financial barriers for trans women to access PrEP in Peru. There's also issues around accessing PrEP and HIV treatment in other parts of North America. And so I just wondered if you could comment on, how do you situate this problem, in terms of a global health problem, a global and domestic health problem? Like, could you draw some connections, particularly for those of us on the call who are mostly doing research within Turtle Island?
Of course. Let me get to that by a roundabout way. I want to talk a little bit about the genesis of this talk. So, you know, I've been doing this work for a while, and so I've been doing these presentations, and I'm very close to the community organization that I mentioned. You know, we have weekly calls, and prior to the presentations, like earlier iterations of other talks, you know, I always did the thing of I invited community to come, but there was the language issues, and you know, I was still presenting all the data. And so this year in particular, trying to get more involved in the discourses of decolonizing global health, like what does that even mean? Is it even possible to decolonize a colonial project, et cetera? I have made a shift in the way that I present these data. And so this is a new structure for me in terms of it's not methods heavy. I'm really not telling you much about the finding, like the methods that led to these findings, but this presentation was developed namely with community to really probe on the lessons, and lessons that I simply do not have answers for, and lessons that it's not only community in Peru that's pushing me, my students are pushing me in this in my classes. Like, so you're asking us to do sample size calculations, but yet I'm doing, you know, indigenous ways of knowing. This is an inherent contradiction. So like these lessons are everywhere. And so part of structuring it this way is exactly to get at your question, is these lessons aren't new. Like, but these paradoxes are at the heart of the inequities and the oppressions that we are seeing. But the bigger thing that for me, who's making a career out of this, is really this question of why more data? Like, is the more data really getting at what we want? And I'm not willing to throw out the data. Like, I think data is an incredible tool for advocacy. And, you know, don't get me wrong, like this is not an oversimplification of that, but it is a push on the kinds of data we are collecting and where those data go. So with your question in terms of like looking up and broader reach, I mean, I think these are questions we can all ask ourselves, especially with ongoing pushes in Canada to collect race-based data. Great, let's do it. But also let's learn from what's going on in the States with the huge inequities and problems with race-based data collection. So like this stuff can't happen apolitically because there's ongoing fights that we need to learn from. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you. Yes, that's very powerful. You have me thinking deeply about my own work as someone, as a nerd who loves data, but who hears loud and clear that data themselves are not going to move resources and make action. So thank you. So we do have a couple of questions from your audience, so let me read them out one at a time. Are there barriers being created through the Peru government, or have they been more supportive than the US government? And related to this, have you had any history of empowering people of Peru to access government resources or resources to fight the government?
Yeah, thank you for those questions. So the first question is a long-winded question, and if this is of interest to you, I'd be delighted to have a longer conversation. But in short, when HIV emerged, was diagnosed in Peru, et cetera, it was a moment of great political upheaval in Peru. It was at the beginning of the Fujimori presidency and great internal strife in Peru with insurgency and counterinsurgency movements, namely the Shining Path. And so HIV gets identified and Fujimori is fighting, quote unquote, domestic terrorism. So what happens with HIV is there was a US naval outpost in Lima that was tasked with monitoring HIV and trying to understand progression of disease. What also ended up happening is understanding of HIV conformed to US rubrics. So namely the understanding and the importation of MSM into Peru. And there's phenomenal literature. Marcos Cueto has a beautiful book about it. And if this is of interest, I can push in that literature of on the ground pushing about like, this category doesn't make sense to us. We don't understand gender and sexuality in this way, and like the politics of that importation. The reason I'm going back so far is because it's pretty important to understand the early structuring of HIV and the close relationship with the US to better understand this question. So HIV research has been integral in the Peruvian response to HIV, especially the Peruvian response to those on the margins of society, namely gender and sexual minorities, and now especially Venezuelan migrants because of the Venezuelan diaspora. So research has been seen to kind of like fit these gaps in a way. So when you ask about more supportive, it's not about more or less supportive, and there's this big distinction between treatment and access and research. And so while treatment exists, the ability to access treatment is so incredibly challenging, especially for gay men, gay women, trans women. So, I mean, like anyone on the margins of society that are not able to access or advocate for themselves to access those resources. So the support piece is tricky. The other key piece of this is because of the large investment of funds coming from, especially the US and the UK with the Wellcome Trust into Peru, many of the resources have been structured around this influx of funds. So there has been a relationship created around this for both good and for bad. So let me just give you a counterexample of this. So like when HIV was identified in Brazil, Brazil was going through a period of redemocratization. And so took up HIV as a project of civil society. And we have the early successes from Brazil with treatment access and fighting against patents and producing of medications as examples of this. It was almost the exact opposite in Peru because of Fujimori and the neoliberal regime that was coming in. And so up until recently, Brazil monitored extensively and rigidly how research was being done in country. And that was very different than how it was being done in Peru. Peru, US funds can flow quite easily to do this kind of research. So there is support for this. And with the support, the push now is for greater accountability with how those funds go. So I know that was an exceedingly long-winded answer and probably not what you were looking for, but there's a very, very long history to this that it's not part of this talk. So the other piece of the puzzle is if I have any history empowering people in Peru and resources to fight the government. So this is also a tricky question. So I mean, yes, currently I'm in the fight, like I'm in the fight to get more money to Peru for communities to do their own research and to figure out their own research agendas. I also believe strongly that I should not be doing the primary data collection. It's all about community capacity and to improve the way research is being done to really be justice informed and equity driven. Empowering people is tricky. I think I have been empowered to be able to give this kind of talk. I mean, if anything, it's a constant learning, a constant co-learning, and constant tensions in just exceedingly different contexts. So as I sit in Toronto and complain about, my two little kids who've been, sick all semester, my colleagues in Peru just went through an attempted coup last week, right? Where the president tried to dissolve Congress, got ousted, and then the vice president became president. So in this context, how do we then talk about like drug importation, getting people adherent to study drugs, getting people enrolled? Like there's just a mismatch with how we understand the importance of research among precarity. So that was a very long-winded answer. Seb, if you have any follow-ups, as you can tell, I'm quite passionate about like the whole political history, and I'd be delighted to share resources.
Yeah, I wish we could talk about that for much longer because it's fascinating, and I have a lot of questions. And I saw you got a thumbs up, a couple of thumbs up from Seb. So I think you've answered their question, which is great. So let me then ask Julia's question, who first says, "Thank you for the fantastic and thought-provoking talk. Can you provide examples of how researchers can make sure they are accountable to those they are researching?"
Yeah, and I mean, I would love to open this up. And if people have great experiences and examples, like I am all ears, like I'm actively trying to learn. So one of the things that I'm trying to do, and, Travis, similar to you, my bread and butter is data. Like that's what I've been trained to do. That's what I enjoy. That's why I've been, have followed this career. But more and more, it's become quite clear that the only people who read the papers are myself, team, and the students that I assign it to. So one of like my big, growing pains has been, okay, like this has got to stop. So what are the other ways? Infographics in the Peruvian context have worked really well for community to then advocate like at rallies or when they have meetings with different government officials, because it just synthesizes the research in very easy ways. And, we can synthesize the data in ways that support the argument. So infographics have been huge for us. Digital stories and short videos have also been really good to disseminate larger information. So during COVID-19, at the very early stages, Peru did a sex-based mobility restriction where men could go out Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, or Monday, Wednesday, Friday, women Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, and everyone had to stay home on Sunday. I mean, as you can imagine, this was an utter failure. And folks who did not fall into gender binaries, incredible violence and just horrific experiences. So digital stories was a way that we could quickly capture the data that we were seeing and get it out there, because it was, it was a bare minimum that we could do. So infographics, digital stories. The other thing that I'm so pumped about recently is, you saw the photos in my presentation. We've been working with journalists, and a close colleague, Alfonso Silva Santisteban, has taken to photography and getting trained, et cetera, and all this stuff. And it has been phenomenal. It really changes how policymakers and other key stakeholders understand the data that you are trying to present. And so, for a while there, I was trying to do like more quotes and then less graphs and, et cetera, but pictures are really working for us. So those are some of the tools that we are using to support in knowledge dissemination and holding us accountable to like getting this information out. But if we're talking about real accountability is money and access to resources outside of study end, like period. And the access to resources outside of study end is not something I have a solution to, and something that I think about a lot. So that's where we need to go.
Thank you. And I also heard in your answer, a call for those who are here with us to offer their suggestions and ideas for how we can improve that accountability. But I primarily work with quantitative data, and the more and more research I do, the more and more I realize that participants don't want to look at tables and publications. That they want to have conversations. They want to feel that there's like engaging moments. So I love what you're saying about storytelling. I was on the sidelines of an Indigenous research project over the last year, and just about every community we visited, they didn't actually say, "Oh, thank you so much for doing this research and turning it into a publication or a public health report." They just said, "Thank you for coming to talk to us. Please come back to talk to us again." I mean, people just want to talk and be heard and be seen. And it does occur to me that a lot of the systems we have in place, or that we've learned or inherited in terms of Western approaches to research are not going to cut it if that's the benchmark. Maybe I'll ask the next question in the chat, but kind of keep that topic around accountability open in case folks have things to add. So Mirtha says, "Thank you for such a helpful and insightful presentation. What have you seen when it comes to navigating the current colonial and Western-based systems of academic funding? when trying to fund your projects that intersect advocacy and applied praxis at the forefront? So I'll leave that big question there.
Yeah, so I have to say, so again, you know, I'm new to the Canadian funding system. I've been playing this game now for 3 years, and let me say this, and if we see each other again in a few years, let me take it back as I learn. But from what I am seeing, and from what the small successes I've had, there do seem to be more funds for advocacy and community-led research in Canada as compared to the US. So, for example, I was blown away that the SHRC PEG Partnership Engage grant existed, right? Like, is it huge money? No, but you know what? $25,000 goes a long way in Peru to like be led by community-directed initiatives. So it does exist. Funding is this really tricky piece because you're being funded to do something. You're being funded to generate data. And then the end question is, who owns that data and where does that data go? So at least with a tri-council funding, the ownership of the data becomes like researcher governed, I guess I would say. More and more, I have seen a shift to advocacy-based funding coming from pharma, at least in the HIV field, which is really tricky. And it speaks to how global funding priorities have shifted. So when I first moved to Peru in 2009, there was quite a large presence of the Global Fund that was there to fund programmatic activities. It was not there to fund research. Post 2008 global economic crash, most of the programmatic funds have been pulled from global health, and global health money is now research money. So when you ask about money for advocacy, like there was once a time where community-based organizations could apply for grants and there were grants to be had. I'm sure that they still exist. In fact, I know that they still exist, but the pool is much smaller. So, and that's something that I try to keep at the forefront of my head, because even though I am reflexive and I really try to be explicit with where funding goes, these funds are for research and for data collection. And so that is also the push of this talk and the push to say, we need more funds for community, right? To not do research, to do all the other stuff that is needed to make the research happen. So in the Peruvian context, social movements are big. Social movements stop research projects. And so there is time and money that is needed to speak with different community-based organizations that are tangentially related. So I'm currently doing a project with Venezuelan sex workers, and time and money is needed to speak with different feminist organizations because, oh, by the way, we need to talk about what erotic labor is and looks like and how we talk about that in other ways. So I know, again, these are all divergence because these are big questions, but I shy away from this issue of advocacy with research. I think it's a bit of co-opting. Like I actually want to go back and just have streams of funding specifically for advocacy and community empowerment, with the understanding that those need to exist to have ethical research happen.
Thank you. I mean, they're big multi-stranded answers because these are big questions. So I really appreciate everything that you're offering in terms of your reflections and your experience. I just want to, I don't quite know how to acknowledge this, but I'm just thinking about my own positionality sitting in British Columbia in a place where for some people, in particular for gay men, you know, we have publicly funded a program for wide-scale access to HIV PrEP, and that entire program exists because of studies like the IPREX trial. So we are in fact indebted to trans women and other participants in IPREX in Peru. And I don't really, this is kind of a half-baked idea, but I do think like there is maybe something for those of us who are in positions of privilege, who are in publicly funded healthcare systems in places like British Columbia, to like to kind of encourage our healthcare users to have a little bit more critical reflection around, I forget what you called it, but it kind of sounded like a scientific industrial complex to me.
Yeah, reflection is totally needed, but and it's also like the politics of how this stuff gets done, right? So like, again, big answers, but like the successes of IPREX came at the heels of a failed PrEP study in sub-Saharan Africa because cis women said, no, like you're not testing this drug on us without giving us access to the drug post-study end. And so the rebranding and the repurposing of what became IPREX in another global region kind of gets washed away with the successes of IPREX. And so part of this reflection, I think, needs to be talking about the politics. So, you know, now in the land of moving towards injectable PrEP, which again, like what a huge technological advance. When we think about cabotegravir and we think about how it was tested and the inclusion exclusion criteria, so the communities I work with, people were pissed. A main exclusion criteria in Latin America was injectable silicone. Every community that I work with, I mean, the prevalence of injectable silicone is astronomical. So who's participating in those studies? And if it's not tested among women with injectable silicone, are they able to access injectable PrEP? And so again, like I know that this is like a very narrow example, but it's about the greater politics at play within these research systems. And, you know, we're just running so fast that we're not taking a moment to be like, this shit is uncomfortable. Like it's uncomfortable, it's messy, and we have to be in it to figure out like what the next step is going to be.
Well, with that statement, I just want to offer again a huge heartfelt thanks on behalf of the team at the Center for Gender and Sexual Health Equity for joining us today and sharing. Amaya, thank you for your time and your work, and I look forward to when our paths cross again.